Morning. Today we are continuing our series on Meet Jesus, and we're in a passage where he's squaring off against Jesus' enemy that he often has in the Gospels, the Pharisees. And I was just curious, how many of you would consider yourselves ancient Hebrew scholars? I wouldn't consider myself an ancient Hebrew scholar either, so that I would have to put my hand down as well, because I didn't know a lot of these things that I'm getting ready to tell you about. I had to look them up for myself because I'm not an ancient Hebrew scholar. But I did know there was something called a Mishnah. And a Mishnah is a set of rules that the Pharisees had put forth as a hedge or a fence around the law. And in this, that they set up these rules to follow the rules, because that's how the Pharisees were. And it's because they didn't want to break any rule, and so they had to set up these all new rules. In fact, if you want to be honest, there's more rules and laws in the Mishnah and the different writings of the Pharisees than there are in the actual law of God. Because they were so concerned about breaking or accidentally breaking any one thing. And so they very much focused on this. In fact, if you want some like modern context, because this is still something that happens today in Jewish cultures, because they very much are afraid to break some of these laws if you're a Orthodox Jew. And so what happens is, like, Jewish people on Saturday, which is the Sabbath, cannot answer the phone, whether it be your cell phone, landline, anything, because that's considered work. And so if you have a Jewish friend and you try to call them on Saturday, they're not going to answer. It's just not going to happen. And that's just one of the many things they have. But I wanted to see what it was like in the first century. I wanted to see what it was like when Jesus was alive. What were some of these rules that they had to follow the rules? And so I'm going to give you some to start off my sermon today. And the first one is the thing that got Jesus in trouble, and so we're going to kind of start there. You couldn't walk through a field, which Jesus is doing in the story, and they're picking grain off, and they're considering that bad. But not only could you not walk through, they didn't want you to walk through a field, not because they were afraid you might pick the grain, but your sandal might accidentally clip the grain, which would be considered harvesting. Or how about, you couldn't spit on the ground, because what if when you spit on the ground, it created mud, and then we all know mud is mortar, and making mortar is work. Or what about this one? You can't climb a tree on the Sabbath, because what if you knocked a branch out of the tree, which would be pruning, which is also work? Or what about, you can't pluck a hair, because plucking a hair is shearing. And we all know if you shear, like shear a sheep, that's work. And if you pluck a hair, that's the same thing as shearing. Or they even went so far with this one that they even suggested you not ever look in a mirror on the Sabbath, because you might see a gray hair and that might tempt you to pluck a hair. And so they actually required that you not look in a mirror on the Sabbath day. Or what about this one? Because I'm sure that we would all struggle with this. You can't eat radishes on the Sabbath, not because they're unclean, but because it was common to dip your radishes in salt. And what if you left them too long in the salt and they accidentally pickled? And pickling something on the Sabbath would be work. And you can't do that. You see, they had all these rules to follow the rules. And if you notice, in some cases, they had rules to follow the rules to follow the rules. Because they were so afraid of breaking anything. So we have to ask ourselves, if the Pharisees were so keen on not breaking these rules of the Sabbath, why did God establish the Sabbath? What was the purpose of it? If it was so important that they didn't want to break it, why did he do it? So if you have your Bibles with you, you can follow up on the screen. We're just going to read one verse real quick from Leviticus, so you don't necessarily have to turn to it. But in Leviticus chapter 23, I'm not going to read tons of passages out of the law because it really breaks down the Sabbath, but I just want to kind of give you these little clips of the law that show you kind of the importance of the Sabbath. And so Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3 says this: 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day, which was Saturday, on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. And I think this is the verse in all of the law that sums up the Sabbath the best. And I think that because the Sabbath was installed for two things, and this verse talks about both of those things very briefly. It doesn't really describe them and what they are, and it doesn't break them down, but it mentions both of them in the same passage. And so if we look at it, we see that God established the Sabbath as a time of rest. You shall do no work. A solemn rest is what Leviticus 23:3 says. Well, to get a little more insight on this, let's turn over to Exodus 23. And in Exodus 23, verse 12, we see this. 6 days you shall do no work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. You see, it didn't just apply to you, but it applied to everything in your household. God acknowledged that we need rest. The people needed to rest. They couldn't just have this time where they would just work. And let's be honest, we, as especially Americans, are kind of bad at that. And we sometimes say that the younger generations are too lazy and they don't know what hard work is. But the thing is, still, even today, even with those younger generations, you do realize that America is one of the countries that works the most in the entire world. Of all the hours that we work a week, we're in the I believe we're in the top 10. In fact, most European countries and most African countries, most South American countries, they all understand the concept of maybe you don't need to work 8-hour days and you work and then you take a little nap and then you go back to work and for a few hours and you just rest in between. And what they have found is, in some ways, those people are actually healthier because they have less stress. Americans often are very stressed because we just work all the time. And that's not always bad because it means you're advancing in your career, but there is negative to it, and God understood that. He understood that the Israelites needed time to rest because they were at a time where it took a lot to do the things they needed to do, to work the fields, to do all of that. It took a lot of work, and if they didn't take time to rest, they would wear themselves out very quickly. They needed to rest. People need to rest. But that wasn't the only reason that God established the Sabbath. God also established the Sabbath as a time for worship. As a time for worship. This is the holy convocation. If we turn to Exodus 31, we see this. In Exodus 31, verses 13 and the first part of 14, it says, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, 'Above all you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you.'" You see, that's the importance of the Sabbath. It's a time where you are actually remembering God. You're remembering that He is the one who sanctified them. He is the one that allowed them to have this holy day. And in fact, whenever it's first established all the way in Genesis, it's a time to remember that Jesus, or not Jesus, but God, the Trinity, made everything. He made the entire world with His voice. God didn't need to rest on the seventh day. He created everything in 6 days. I believe in a literal 6 days. He created everything in 6 days. He didn't have to rest. He could have kept on going. This is God, the all-powerful God. He doesn't need sleep. He doesn't need rest. He's good to go. I mean, He created things out of nothing by speaking them into existence. I think He's good to keep going. Yet, why did He rest? Because He wanted the people to take a day to not only rest for themselves, but also to remember what it was that God had done. To remember that God was the creator of the universe. To remember that He was the one who brought them out of Egypt. And another passage that talks about Sabbath, it tells them to actually remember that. Remember that I was the one who delivered you out of Egypt. They were told to remember these things about God and to worship him. You see, we as people, we need time, a set time to where we can remember God. Because if not, we are fickle people. And the Israelites were no different. Let me just point to the time of the wilderness with the Israelites. God sends 10 plagues on Egypt. They're fresh out of Egypt on the border of the Red Sea. They had seen God bring darkness. They had seen God send plagues. They had seen God send locusts that devoured the crops and frogs that filled the homes. They had seen the firstborn dead die. And still, what do they do when they get to the Red Sea? Oh, man. What are we going to do now? I mean, they even had an image of God behind them. A fiery pillar that was actually blocking the Egyptian army from getting to them, and they were still complaining at the edge of the Red Sea because they thought they were done for, and they started saying, we were better off in Egypt. We might as well just go back there. How fickle, how forgetful they are of who God is. And what happens when they get to the promised land after they've seen Moses get the 10 Commandments on Sinai? They get to the promised land and they're sent in to see it. And the 10 were bad, 2 were good. They find 2 that say, we can do this because God is good. But the 10 scare the rest of the Israelites because they say they're giants, they're huge, the cities have walls. We can't do it. You have God on your side who defeated the most powerful nation in the world when they tried to follow them across the Red Sea by crashing the Red Sea back upon them. And yet they still had no confidence in him, no trust, no remembrance for what God had done. So what happens? 40 years in the wilderness. They get manna. They get quail. And what are they still doing? Tired of manna and quail. And we laugh, and it's good to laugh because, let's face it, it's ridiculous. But are we any different? We have all these great things. We live in America, one of the most blessed nations in all the history of mankind. And why do we have all these blessings? Because God has been good to us. Why do we have these blessings as individuals? Because God has allowed us the gifts and abilities to have a job and to work and to get this money that we have. Yet do we give him the credit? Do we make sure that we come on Sunday morning to give him an offering as an act of worship because we're like, God, you've been so good to me. I want to make sure I give back to you because I acknowledge that this is all yours anyway and I have no right to it except the right that you give me? Or are we thinking, I had to work 6 days this week and I would just like to sleep in one morning. So I'm not going to go to church and worship God. I'm going to sleep in. We're fickle people, aren't we? We're no different. You see, people need to remember and worship God. Seems simple enough, right? So why all the rules to follow the rules? Seems simple enough just to honor the Sabbath, like the 10 Commandments says, the 4th of the 10 Commandments. Just honor the Sabbath. It seems simple. Just honor it, rest, worship. It would have been easy for the Jews to do, you would think. But here we are in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. Mark chapter 2, verses 23 and 28. Again, it's up on the screen behind me if you don't want to find it in your Bible. And here it says, one Sabbath, he, meaning Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did? When he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. You see, the Pharisees had forgotten something. For all their desire to make sure they followed the law to a T, so they set up these rules to follow the rules, they had forgotten the purpose of the Sabbath. They had forgotten who it was for. They all of a sudden started putting too much emphasis on just following the rules rather than realizing what it was all about. This is called that they were focused on the word of the law instead of the spirit of the law. And sometimes people do that. They get so focused on what the words say that they forget the purpose behind the words, the meaning behind the words. And so they fixate so much on the words that they lose sight of what God was doing. And that's what the Pharisees were kind of known for. That's why the Pharisees and Jesus were constantly butting heads. Because Jesus was all about the spirit of law. Why did God establish this? Why is he doing this? What is the purpose of this? So you can understand what I'm getting ready to do in the new covenant. So you can understand what I'm getting ready to do when I sacrifice my life on the cross. So you can understand what I'm going to do whenever I establish the church here on this earth, the new Israel. They needed to understand the spirit of it. Why God did it in the first place. But the Pharisees couldn't see it because they were too focused on the words. They had lost sight of the one who gave the words. And what this is called is legalism. And people still struggle with it today. We struggle so much with having all these rules that we have to govern everything. But the whole book of Galatians is basically Paul's critique of legalism. That's why he wrote the entire book of Galatians. Why we shouldn't be so focused on that. In fact, over and over again in the epistles, they talk about how there's these Judaizers, which were legalistic Christians that were still following the laws to a T of the Jewish tradition, but still trying to be Christians. And they were constantly combating them. Not because they were necessarily bad people, but those people didn't understand the purpose of it all. What it was all about. They were still trying to make it a rule-based religion rather than a grace-based religion. But one of the things that makes Christianity different, and we've talked about this before, how out of all the major religions in the world, you know what sets Christianity apart? It is the only one that's not about what you do. It's about what Jesus did for you. Every other one, you have to work and work and work and prove that you are good enough. But Christianity acknowledges what's the truth. You're not good enough. You will never be good enough. The spirit of the law is that he wanted you to be broken and to see that you couldn't keep the law. Because if you can't keep the law, then you can't get to heaven. And if you can't get to heaven, then there's no chance of salvation unless someone offers grace. And we see that in the cross. That's what sets Christianity apart. That's what makes Christianity different. And that was God's plan all along. But the Pharisees had forgotten about this because they needed rules to follow rules to follow rules to follow the rules. And they just kept on going and going and going. And if any time it came back that all of a sudden someone broke the Sabbath, they're like, well, we need to apply another rule so we make sure that doesn't happen again. They were missing the point. They didn't understand. They didn't understand that Sabbath was for man, not man for Sabbath. They saw Sabbath as just this holy thing that they had to apply their lives to. But really, Sabbath was designed to help man. To provide them with the rest they needed. To provide them with a special day where they could set time out to make sure they were worshiping God, remembering who God was. Man was the important part, not Sabbath. Man was the more important part. They had switched those. They had made Sabbath the end all, and man had no value. But that's not the way of it. You see, Jesus shows the true purpose of Sabbath and who it's for. And so that he states that as God, that's why he's claiming to be, when he claims to be the Son of Man, that is a term that goes all the way back into Daniel. Whenever the Son of God is going to come and do things in Daniel, it's his Son of Man coming in on the clouds. That is the Son of Man. People knew that whenever he called himself the Son of Man, he was claiming Godship. He was claiming that he was and the Father were one. That's why over and over again when Jesus is claiming these type of things, the Pharisees get really mad. Because that's blasphemy, unless it's true. And in Jesus' case, it was true. So it's not blasphemy. Now, if anyone in this room starts saying that they are the Son of God or the Son of Man in that context, then that's a problem. Because we are not God. And that is blasphemy. But in Jesus' case, that was the truth. And so he gives them these examples. He gives them these examples of David who went in and ate bread. He wasn't supposed to. It was against the law. But it wasn't about the law. It was about the people. And what did they need? They needed bread. So why wasn't their punishment rained down on David's head because of it? Because David understood the spirit of the law. Because he had a heart after God's. But it doesn't stop there. If we go to some of these other passages, including the one that we spoke about in Mark, we see that there's healing. In some of the passages, it talks about that he heals the person with a withered hand. Well, healing, guess what? Is work. You can't heal on the Sabbath. So don't get sick on the Sabbath if you're Jewish. You will receive no medical care. Not going to happen. You cannot be healed on the Sabbath because that's work. So what does Jesus do? Purposely heals people on the Sabbath. Why? Because it's not about the Sabbath, it's about the people. And he's trying to teach them that they're missing the point. They're only looking at the word of the law and not the spirit of the law. And he doesn't stop there. In one of the passages, it actually says he heals a lame man next to a pool. And the guy's asking for someone to move him into the pool because this was the tradition of those that were lame and blind and different ailments. And so what does he do? He's asking people to help him. But no one's helping him. Why? Because to help him in, to pick him up, or even push him in is, guess what? Work. And you can't do that on the Sabbath. So Jesus does one better. He doesn't help him get into the pool. He just goes ahead and heals him and allows him to walk. He takes it one step farther. And man, were the people that didn't like Jesus, were they mad? Over and over again, he's making them upset. And he's trying to get them to understand the truth. That the Sabbath is for people, not people for the Sabbath. That sometimes there's things that kind of supersede the Sabbath. Sometimes there's things that supersede the law. It's kind of what the whole Sermon on the Mount is about. It's about the kingdom of man. And when he says, you hear that you shouldn't commit murder, but I tell you that if you've even thought anger in your heart about your brother or sister, you've committed murder already. Now, at first, it seems more harsh. But what he's trying to do is, you're thinking it's just about what you do. I'm telling you it's about what you think and believe. You're focused on the actions and the words. I'm focused on the Spirit. Because I'm so focused on eternity instead of the here and now. That's what Jesus is trying to say in all those passages. I'm focused on what's to come. And so over and over again, Jesus keeps doing this, that the Sabbath was for the people. And if we're starting to think about this, how this applies to our life, you see, the Sabbath still has meaning. We acknowledge that we don't strictly follow the Sabbath anymore. We don't have a day of Sabbath. I know that there's some of you that maybe were raised in a home, or maybe you've known people that treat the Sunday as Sabbath. The Sunday is not Sabbath. Saturday is clearly the Sabbath day. And some people, I even remember my dad who didn't believe in this, but he was always very leery of allowing us to do too much on Sunday because there were some people in the church that treated Sunday as Sabbath, and he was worried that kind of above reproach type thing that they would think ill of him if he allowed us to like mow the yard on Sunday afternoon because that would maybe reflect poorly. Now, eventually he kind of got over it, but I remember when I first started helping mow, he was like, well, we can't do it on Sunday, so you have to do it this day because, not because he believed that, he was just concerned about what other people might think. And the fact of the matter is that We don't really celebrate it like that anymore, but the concepts and the meaning behind it are still important for us, even if we don't follow it like the Jewish people did. You see, we still need time for rest. And I hit on this a little bit. We may not have a special day for rest, and I'm not saying you need to take out a whole special day for rest, but if you're constantly on the go, and I know what it's like for some of the younger families in here, when you have kids involved in activities, and my kids aren't involved in that many activities yet, but I know they will be. And I've done youth ministry before where you're constantly struggling to try to balance all the schedules because the kids' schedules are just so crazy, and it feels like you never stop. And I remember myself as a kid, and I got news for you. I was involved in tons of clubs and lots of sports, and I was not as busy as the kids are today. I just wasn't. Kids today are so busy, and so young parents are even busier.